Hey, what's up, everybody? Peace and power, elevation. Salam alaikum wa rahmatullah. Salam alaikum wa rahmatullah to all you beautiful Muslim brothers and sisters out there. Ramadan Mubarak to those who celebrate Ramadan. And just greetings, everybody. All right, so this your girl Tiffany coming through here live in the fade. Tonight's subject will be about the Malay Revolt that took place in Brazil. All right, in Bahia, Brazil. Bahia, Brazil. You gotta say it. Not Brazil, but Brazil. But no, tonight's topic is going to be about that. Um, so it's very unique and it's rarely spoken of. These Africans that were Muslims, they waited to Ramadan to revolt. So, I mean, who could ever imagine why you might ask yourself, who would ever wait to Ramadan on the month where everybody's supposed to be fasting and be at peace to have a slave revolt? Well, these Africans, they didn't care. They like, yeah, we're gonna wait. We're gonna wait till when Ramadan come. And we're gonna get these busters. That's how they feel. We're gonna get their asses. They was cocky and bold with it. So I decided to go ahead and do a subject on this. But I want to show you guys a little illustration that I thought was very interesting right here. This little picture. So this picture right here is say Revolta dos Malays. So Malays revolt basically is the Ramadan revolt. Okay. All you can see is those brothers pretty much fighting against slavery. So they resisting. So yeah, you had a lot of group of people that did that. Let me tell you. So the largest Islamic population amongst the tribes were the Hausa Fulani people, the Mandingo, and the Wolof people. Okay, these four are the largest, the main groups that have the largest Islamic community. Okay, I'm gonna say the Hausa, the Fulani, the Mandinkas, and the Wolof. All right, they have the largest Islamic groups. All right. So with that being said, these individuals, I think they were from the Hausa tribes or descendant of the Hausa tribe. However, they revolted. They fought back. They said they're not going to take it. They're not going to go for it. They can't deal with it any longer. Let's go ahead and let's look at some information. So now I kind of switch it up because instead of me using what I would normally use, the Wikipedia source, okay, I am just going to use different sources, right, from jster.org and this other source, which comes from the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences, okay, that came out in 1992. All right, and this article here came out in 1988, but it's still useful, right? And there's a book called Slavery in Brazil. All right, so I have that, and then I have another book that I'm gonna use called Illuminating the Blackness, Blacks and African Muslim in Brazil. All right, so let me go ahead and let's get to the first one where it says King Zumbi and the Malay movement in Brazil. Alrighty. All right, so King Zumbi and the Malay movement in Brazil. The three great regions of America deserve a Muslim's attention because of their Islamic past. Brazil and South America, the Caribbean, which scarcely have been explored in this respect, and the United States. Over 12% of the United States population, and even more in the Caribbean, is of African origin, whereas Brazil has a similar or greater portion of African descent. The enslavement and transportation of Africans to the New World continued for another 3 or 4 centuries after the region's indigenous Indian population had either been killed off or driven into the plains and woods. While knowledge of the original African Muslims in North America is vaguely acknowledged, research is still required on the West Indies. Brazil case, however, is clear due to its proud history of the Pomares Republic, which almost achieved its freedom in the 17th century, and the clearly Islamic 19th century Malay movement. As a postscript, the Canundos movement in 1897 also contains some Islamic features. All right, and it goes down to say in Spanish colonies, the decline of the indigenous population began quickly. To offset this development, the Ptolemy de las Casas, all right, Bishop of Chapala, Mexico, suggests the importation of enslaved Africans to the new colonies, where they could then be converted to Christianity. Few persons have exercised such a baneful effect on society as this man, who is often called the Apostle of the Indies. However, others knew him as enslaver of Africans, especially the Muslim who he called Moors. These facts of African slavery apply to almost all of the Atlantic coast of the Americas, from Maryland and Virginia to Argentina, as well as to some countries along the Pacific coast, such as Ecuador and Peru. If this aspect of Muslim history and the Islamic heritage is to be preserved for human history, we need to devote more study to it. And I want to stop right there before I continue. Someone the other night, and shout out to Brother Vinyasa, I believe, he spoke about the information where there was a certain set of Africans they wanted in South America, okay, in particularly Brazil area. They didn't want those who were already into religious practice. They wanted those who were like into African spirituality, okay, because they wanted to be able to easily convert those individuals into the Abrahamic religion. Because most of the Africans they got, those people were already practicing the Abrahamic religion, and those were the ones that were practicing Islam. And they were practicing Islam more than they did with Christianity, because like I mentioned before, Islam is widely accepted in West Africa than Christianity. So Islam is like predominantly practiced over in those areas, especially when you go to places like Gambia, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Senegal, part of Cameroon, Mali, Guinea-Bissau. You will find that there's a strong Muslim population over in those areas. So where those regions where they got the Africans from, they were already into the Islamic culture or practice. But let's continue. Okay. So go further down. I'm going to skip some of it. In 1532, the first permanent European settlement was established in Brazil, a country which since that date has never been wholly cut off from West Africa. Even today, trade is carried on with the Guinea coast. Yoruba influence from Nigeria and Benin has almost been as pervasive in some regions of Brazil, all right, as Portuguese influence. Nago means Yoruba, and Gago refers to the Iwe from Dahomey and modern Benin and Togoland. Though there are some traces, the use of these native African languages has disappeared, and expressions generally remain only as vocabulary items. All right. So the house of slave known as Usa in Brazil were generally Muslim who retained their faith for as long as they could at a time were able to convert other captives to it. Alufa is the term for a black imam in Rio de Janeiro. Lasno is a Brazilian term for an imam or a leader in prayer. Musulimi, and also Malay is the name for Muslims in the state of Bahia. Malay also has the possible meaning of one who is originally from Mali, or it could be from a word for Muslims in the Yoruba language. The phrase Fazia Sasla or Sarda in a variant of Arabic Salah means praying in Bahia. And it says Yoruba from the coastal areas of Benin and the Gulf of Guinea were known in Brazil as Nigos. They are now found mainly in the state of Bahia, where their influence is still felt. Sudani groups from the Northlands were the Fulani and Uza peoples. The Nigos and Uza in Brazil were thus Yoruba and Hausa slaves, respectively. The Minyas and Iwe slaves came from the Gold Coast, which is now today Ghana. King Zumbi and Pomares were most likely one of their descendants. The name Malay is used to designate Menigos from the ancient empire of Malay. Although Imali is a Yoruba word for Muslims, those who came from Angola were known as Bantus, and those from the Niger Delta as Calabars or Igbos. These different African nations were kept apart in Brazil, and their tribal rivalries were fostered in order to keep them in dissensions. The Portuguese also segregated their slaves along ethnic lines or into guilds in order to promote division among them. Now let's go further down where it says since many Africans were known to be Muslim, this policy continued. The Christian reconquista of Spain and Portugal by projecting it overseas. Slave owners feared some of the Muslim slaves, such as the Wolofs or Jellofs, the Wolofs, and the Mendigos for the captives had faith and as believers possessed moral strength and character. Thousands of West African villagers, or more likely millions when the total number is added up, who ranged from common farmers to artisans and merchants, were seized in brutal slave raids and sent to the New World. Frequently, the prisoners taken in these raids were Muslim from the inland kingdoms of Songhai, Hausaland, and Mali. So now, let's go down. Let's skip down. It says, life in Zenzalas debased the Africans who were forced to live in them, as do the favelas, which is the slum shanty towns surrounding present-day Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, or those of Havana or Harlem, whereas the quilombos provided them with some dignity. Cuisine and cooking, if they can be differentiated, were influenced by these forced migrants who had to labor in plantation kitchen, where they adapted typically West African vegetables like okra, yams, along with roots, crops, and condiments for their stew and other dishes. Their leaders and priestesses still display economic competence and courteous manners as they direct their various sayitas. These sayitas are fetish cults complete with Orisha, a term which originally meant pagan deities but now includes the cult priests, like the black witch doctors who practice popular medicine in Bahia. All right, so the daughters in the Candomblé are still active in Brazilian life, and they perform sometimes with the set junior members the batucada dance in these ritual assemblies. All right, so I'm trying to get to the part about the slave revolt. All right. Let's go down. All right, so let's go. As a matter of fact, before I get there, let me just go up a little bit. All right, so Ganga Zumbi, said to have been born in 1735 in Porto Cavalo on the north coast of Alagoas. His slave name was Francisco. Before the end of his campaign, he had become a grandfather and was said to have a white wife as well. He had a palace called Ganga Sago or Zona, but we are not told whether this was the name, a title, or a mere nickname. Zombi's capital was called Macacos, which means monkeys in Portuguese. This town was located in Serra de Barriga and contained 500 houses and 8,000 inhabitants, according to one estimate. The vicarious name for the the vigorless name for capital makes one suspect that this was merely a derisive nickname. We must always remember that whatever we know about the Palmares Republic is what the Portuguese, its enemies, have transmitted to us. The Palmares records are non-existent. Some writers place the total number of inhabitants at 30,000. The number varies because of our lack of reliable statistics. All right, so it says the town of Macacos was fortified either by a mud wall similar to those used in West Africa or by a stockade or palisade, which made it into a real fortress. It passed clay houses were built from red earth and had palm thrashed roofs, although some settlements featured wooden houses. Macacos must have been a somewhat ramshackle place at its height, for it contained a labyrinth of streets and lanes with a little urban planning. The city lay 200 miles from the coastal town of Suriname, Porto Cavo, in Angolas, and could only be reached by going through the wooden mountains rising behind the Atlantic seaboard. Now let's go further down. All right. Let's go to where it says after 1803. All right. First, they talk about the following defeat of the Palmares. Continuous revolt occurred in the Brazilian hinterlands. In 1704, another insertion of the Palmares model broke out, this time in Campoga in the Sierra Negra to the north of Recife. Unrest also occurred at the Cambe Pariba during the early 18th century. In 1719, still another insurrection took place in the new inland state of Minas Gerais, which is general mines in the mining district which the Portuguese had opened up. The first gold strike in Minas Gerais took place in 1695 towards the end of the Palmares episode. In 1763, another slave insurrection broke around Bahia. After 1803, rumblings of the not too distant Malay Revolt began to be heard as black Muslim unrest began to spread around Bahia. And Uza Revolt occupied the Brazilian authorities during the 1807 to the 1809. An uprising occurred in the state of Espírito Santo during the early 1800s. Rio de Janeiro was plagued during the 1823 to 1824 and again in 1876 with lawlessness in 1803 and 1832. Still, other insurrections broke out in Bahia in Hulis, a coastal city to south of Salvador, the chief port and capital of Bahia, and Maranhão, too. The North suffered unrest in 1853. The determination and despair of the Afro-Brazilian to better their lot was evident in these widespread rebellions. Urban revolts took place in 1803 to 1835 in Salvador, where events came to a head. However, it had no real leadership. During 1828 and 1830, some forerunners of the Malay Revolt were heard around Bahia, including its port and capital city of Salvador, as well as in other coastal ports where the Muslims wanted freedom to practice their own religion, the right to not to have to bow down before the Tamatale graven image of the Catholic saints, and the related right of not having to bear the litters of the Tamatale during religious possession. Let's go further down. See, it gets interesting. It says the Malay movement bears the focal date of 1835 in history books and newspaper. On the night between January 24th and the 25th, the revolt of Africans and their descendants broke out in the streets of Salvador and presented a direct threat to the Brazilian soldier and police. This was the result of an underlying unrest which had been brewing for weeks in the coastal cities. Right? And it says the Malay movement thus dates from approximately 1831 to 1837. It was a Sulan rebellion that spread along the coast through central Brazil and South American version of the Thorat al-Zunus revolts of the blacks, which instilled a fear of the Muslims within the Brazilian upper class and army. In a way, this rebellion reflected the resentment of Africans who had been cut off from their cultural roots and forced to subscribe to a faith in graven images rather than one in God alone. It is generally called the Great Malay Revolt of 1835 because the Mandingos from Mali had kept their Islam alive during their centuries-long exile from Africa. These rebels opposed the grosser forms of Christino pagan image worship and the fact that they were not permitted to practice their Islamic faith freely and to worship God alone. The Uza slaves often knew the Quran by heart, but the Brazilian establishment and police did not allow them to read it or to practice their religion. In a generation or two, such knowledge lingered on merely as part of their descendant folkloric memories as it does in the United States as well. So religion played a clear and central role in this uprising, the defeat which engendered the deportation of hundreds of Africans from Brazil and widespread massacres of adherents. The Afro-Brazilians were tired of bowing down before saints and images and of being forced to subscribe to immortades or blasphemous cults dedicated to semi-deities, which they rightly regarded as a deviation from the worship of the sole God. The pagan fraternities or brotherhoods that the slaves were encouraged to join repelled the Muslims, for they felt it was blasphemous to talk about a mother of God and other such things. All right, so basically, these Muslims say they was tired of being forced into converting into Christianity. They said we're not going. It's already been no. You took away our cultural roots, right? You took us away from our land, our native land, our ancestral land. Now you're trying to take away a religion that we was practicing when we got here, and you want us to give in to something that we don't believe in. You want us to give in to Christianity, which is your religious practice. So we're tired of that. So they say, you know what? We're tired of the fact that we got to be forced to believe in Jesus. We can't go back to our cultural roots. So guess what? We're going to rebel. We're going to fight. We're going to put up a fight for this because we're not just going to go for it anymore. All right. And it says, this issue is like the 17th century uprising in polymerase formed a proletarian movement which compensated for the Africans' feeling of unrest and suppression. These 19th century freedom fighters fought tenaciously against the whole Brazilian army, just as their ancestors had fought the Dutch and Portuguese army a century and a half before. Soon after the defeat of the revolt from 1839 to 41, a balida sweep through the northern coastal state of Maranhão was launched by the Brazilian authorities. Such revolts had plagued Brazil more frequently than in the United States or the West Indies. Pomares, Malays, and Canandos all require sympathetic study in order to explain the deep-rooted religious descent of these oppressed Muslims and their descendants. All right. Then it goes on to say the leader of these 19th century rebellions, when they were not massacred, were shipped back to West Africa by the hundreds. These Brazilian emancipados were frequently Muslim. The Salvador Mosque in Lagos, with its unique Portuguese style of architecture and craftsmanship, was built by them and is maintained by their descendants. Freemen arrived in Nigeria and other ports along the Gulf of Guinea coast as trademen who knew many useful crafts, for they had been trained as carpenters, masons, cobblers, and bakers, and so on, during their harsh and lonely exile overseas. Some of them even had acquired some fluency in Portuguese and English. All right, so that's this article talk about King Zumbi and the Malay movement in Brazil. And it can be found, let me go down to 13. It can be found on this website called A Scholarly Journal of Black Women, which is Sage. Okay, it's written by T.B. Irving, the Mother Mosque Foundation, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Right, and the name of the journal, is the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences. Okay, so this was written around 1992. Okay, it's called the American Journal of Islamic Social Sciences, and it was written in 1992. So if you guys want to look more into that, just type in King Zumbi and the Malay movement in Brazil, or I'll be sure to post in the description link. It could be found on Google Scholar. Just go in Google Scholar and type in that information. All right, so now let's go on to the next source. All right, so the next source that I have is called Slave Resistance in Brazil, Bahia, 1807 to 1835. Ao Jose Reis. Is Ao Jose Reis. All right, so it starts off like this. From the day we left the shores of our father's land, we've been trampled on. Oh, now we know everything. We got to rebel. Somebody got to pay for the work. We done rebel. Bob Marley, Babylon system. Right? During the first half of the 19th century, Bahia, an area of Brazil known for its many sugar plantations, experienced a wave of slave revolts and conspiracy that profoundly marked the consciousness of those who lived in this period, as well as their descendants. Throughout Brazil, Bahian slaves stood as a bad example to the slave class in the eyes of the protectors and beneficiaries of the slave order. Collective slave resistance had occurred before in the region, but Slaves had never demonstrated such militancy between 1807 and 1835. So then it goes on to say the setting. If African slaves are treacherous, Creoles and mulattoes are even more so. And if not for the rivalry between the former and the latter, all political power and social order would crumble before a Servile revolt. Luis dos Santos Bahia, all right, circa 1798. And it says the division among Africans is the strongest guarantee of peace in Brazil's largest city. Conde dos Arcos, governor of Bahia, which is 1814. So they were basically trying to separate African people because they figured that's the best way to control them. All right, so we're going to separate this group over here, these group of African, put them over there, put another group over there, and put that other group over there. So that way we can keep a better eye on each one of them. But that only gave rise to a revolt. That wasn't really the best idea, to try to separate them. But that's what the oppressor thought they could do. It would be easy. It would be a way to manage and keep control. But let's see what else we find in this article. All right, so Bahia in the early 19th century underwent substantial socioeconomic, demographic, and political changes, which profoundly affected the nature of slavery and the composition of the slave class. These changes made slave life more difficult in terms of everyday living condition, the ability to create a visible slave family, and the integration of individual freedmen in Bahia's polity. On the other hand, slaves are free blacks in Bahia, both in the cities and in the rural areas. Probably did not feel lonely within a white-dominated world. On the contrary, their great numbers allowed them to retain a good deal of their African memories and to form a new cultural and organizational strategies of coping with class and ethnic oppression. And towards the end of the 18th century, Brazilian sugar, the dominant export crop of Bahian plantation, experienced a great revival after a depression of over 50 years. The origin of this prosperity, like that of other colonial and dependent economics, lay primary in transformation in the world politics and economy, and in changes in colonial policy, the European wars, the disruption of the plantation society in Saint Dominique in 1790, and a world economic trend of prosperity all helped to enlarge Brazil's share in the international market. The colony was also favored by the Portuguese Pombalian reforms, which better organized Atlantic commerce and established quality control of Brazilian export products. Internationally, the decline of the southern mines ended the diversion of labor and capital to the mining region. Finally, the transference of the Portuguese court to Brazil and the consequent opening of the ports to international investigation further stimulated the colonial economy. Now let's go down to page 6. All right, maybe I'll just start at page 5. All right, so in the urban environment of the busy seaport of Salvador, slaves and free colored people developed to the limits allowed by a slave society. Their creativity in devising strategy of survival, resistance, solidarity, and struggle. The lack of a sizable white population meant that blacks and mulattoes comprised the necessary pool of semi-skilled and skilled laborers. They, in fact, could be found in all positions of the labor structure. In a sample of 582 slaves, Matoso found 42 occupation. They were street peddlers, domestic servant, stevedores, blacksmith, tailors, and so on. All right, free and enslaved black women dominated the so-called small commerce to disguise of the established merchants and government authority. In the late 18th century, an irritated Vahina noted that the black Gahadria, Gahadrias, as these street peddlers were called, practically monopolized the distribution of fish, cooked foods, and even contrabands through an ingenious system of market speculation, which they call carabola or cachetera, which was organized in their quitandas or small shops. They gathered to sell everything. In 1839, when he visited Salvador, Kidder found these women in full activity despite the depression of the time. The male equivalent of the Gahadria were the Negroes de Gajo or Gahadros or Gahadors. They worked primarily as stevedores and chair porters. The stevedores, of course, were fundamental to the sugar export business. Seating chairs, on the other hand, constitute most common means of transportation in Salvador. Given its irregular topography, which did not permit extensive use of carriage or even horses. Mulatto, Creole, and African tailors, surgeons, barbers, and entertainers also filled the streets of the city where they exercised their profession in the open air. The slave Negro de Gajo contracted with their masters to hand over a certain sum at the end of each daily or weekly working journey. Theoretically, any money exceeding the sum contracted for could be kept by the slaves. The system was far from a paternalistic arrangement if we believe the observation of Spitz and Martis, who wrote that the condition of Gahadores was very sad, for they are considered as living capital in action, and since their masters want to recover the capital investment plus interest, they don't spare them. But the capitalist calculation of urban masters encounter certain limits governed by the ability of slaves together with freemen to collectively forge their own work habits, institution, and even a certain work rhythm. So now it gets deep. African slaves, Gahadores, for example, once thrown into the urban labor market, organized themselves into cantos, which were locations in the cities where different groups of slaves offered their services. Each canto received the name of a particular district, plaza, or street of Salvador. Their organization followed a ethnic lines with the Hausa, Iwe, and Yorubas, each belonging to their own canto. Each work group also had a leader called captain of the canto, who functioned as the ultimate link between slaves and the customers. In the cantos, Africans from the same ethnic origin forged new cultural values and collective solidarity. African Muslims used the meeting places to teach Arabics, spread the word of Islam, and sew ritual garments while waiting for the next customer. Together, slaves and free Africans worked, played, prayed, and resist the loss of their identity. Among themselves, they forgot the Christian name given them by the master and instead called each other by their old or new African names. Some were only known by the name of the particular city in Africa which they came, such as certain abrigio known as Oyo, or the slave woman Indum, to whom everybody referred to as Ba. All right, others old and new Muslims kept or adopt Islamic names. In groups of 5 or 6, they carry heavy burdens, singing and walking in that rhythmic pace that impressed visitors to Salvador. These Africans noted a long-time foreign residents. Mm. So now, as I read into this, basically, to sum it up, the whole thing is they wanted to have their own communities. They wanted to be able to have their own environment. They didn't want to be under the control where they could not connect with their identity, African roots, and they could not practice their religion freely. They didn't want that. So they said, well, we need to be able to figure out how we going to stop all of this so we can be more free. So, you had the free and the slaves coming together. They worked together. And they put their heads together and found out a better solution. We going to revolt against this man. We going to revolt against this government. We going to let this government know that we not some punks. We not no scary ass. We ain't one of your average slaves. All right. Yeah, we might be Muslim, but we'll fuck you up. That was their mentality. We'll fuck you up. We ready to fuck you up. You know what I'm saying? Like the late Archie Everslow said, and for those of you that's from the A, Archie Everslow said, we ready. We ready. We ready for y'all. And that's their attitude. They was like, we ready for y'all. We ready for you motherfuckers out there. But they was ready. They had their guards, so they was like, ain't no stopping us now because we on one. Let's go. We on it. Somebody finna catch that heat, and we finna bring the heat. All right. And again, the title of the article is called Slave Resistance in Brazil, Bahia from 1807 to 1835. And it could be found on Slave Resistance in Brazil, Bahia, 1807, 1835 on Luso Brazilian Review. Okay, so that come from the University of Wisconsin Press, summer of 1988. And that is on jster.org. Jster.org. That's the website, jster.org. Okay. Let's see what else I got. All right, so I have a book. This book is called Slavery in Brazil. Let me see if I can find any information. Let me look at the table of content. All right, so I'm not gonna go into it, but in this book, this is chapter 7. And in chapter 7, it talks about slave resistance and rebellion. So you can find this book. You can look it up on Amazon or go to your Barnes and Nobles, or you can get the PDF version, the Kindle, or you can get the physical copy, the paperback copy. All right. So chapter 7 is slave resistance and rebellion. And this book is called Slavery in Brazil. All right. Alrighty then. And this book right here is called Illuminating the Blackness, Blacks and Africans, Muslim in Brazil. So now this is the front cover. Let me look up the Malay movement. All right, well, let me look up slave revolt. All right, so right here, even though it's the preview, however, it talks about the 1835 Malay slave revolt. The 1835 Malay slave revolt is arguably the most significant slave rebellion to have taken place in the history of Brazil and consists of 600 slaves and free persons who are according to, and let's see, that's pretty much, that's all it's talking about. So let's go to the introduction. All right, so let's go to the introduction where it says, the contribution of African Muslims to Brazil. Oh, well, let's look at the intro. So, the introduction, there is a history of Black people without Brazil, but there is no history of Brazil without Black people. All right, that is Jair Garcia. To the Portuguese elite in the 19th century, Brazil, Islam, and Blackness were a dangerous combination. They felt threatened by the presence of African Muslim slaves due to their strong faith, literacy, and experience in military warfare in their homeland. Inspired by the Quranic injunctions to fight oppression and by the Haitian slave revolt, a group of West African Yoruba Muslim unified multi-ethnic African Muslims under the banner of Islam and unifying non-Muslim Africans under the banner of their tribal affiliation to lead a revolt in Bahia in 1835. Though unsuccessful, the revolt led to the abolition of slavery in 1888, which, however, resulted in the exclusion of Blacks and mixed-race Brazilians from participation in the nation's wealth and resources. Today, in their modern-day struggle against anti-Black racism and white supremacy, many Black Brazilian activists draw inspiration from the courage of the African Muslim warriors who valiantly fought for their freedom in the 19th century. Brazil. In a country as ethnically mixed as Brazil, white remains the color of aspiration and success. Whistle black continues to be the color of poverty in a history that some would prefer to forget. This book examines that history. So, Illuminating the Blackness presents the history of Brazil, race relation, and African Muslim heritage. This book is divided into two parts. Part one explores the issues of race, anti-Black racism, white supremacy, colorism, Black beauty, and affirmative action in contemporary Brazil. Part two examines the reports of African Muslim travel to Brazil before the Portuguese colonizer, slave military revolts in Bahia, and West African Muslim communities in 19th century Brazil. The historical significance of the slave revolts remains an important spiritual inspiration and a rally point for what is regarded as Black identity in Brazil. Today, Brazil is the largest and most populous country in South America. Its diverse population includes more persons of African descent than any country except Nigeria. Though many Afro-Brazilian are marginalized in Brazilian society, Black activists in Brazil are campaigning to reawakening the nation's Black consciousness by taking pride in African religion and culture aesthetics. The government of Brazil is also trying to address the nation's socio-economic imbalance between whites and non-whites by enacting affirmative action laws with the intention of promoting racial equality. In 2012, Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff signed Lei de Cota Social, the law of social quotas, which required public universities to reserve half of their admission spots for Brazilians public school students who are primarily of African descent and poor. The quota system is intended to increase the number of students of African descent from 8,700 to 56,000 within 10 years, after which the racial quota system will be discontinued. Other government initiatives were also introduced to address the legacy of slavery that has influenced and shaped current-day race relations in Brazil, where whites control the vast majority of the nation's wealth and resources. That sounds very familiar. That's America. That's America for you. That sounds very familiar, right? That's the similar concept here in America. And it says, although much has been written by anthropologists, historians, and sociologists alike regarding Brazil's racist history, the contribution and perspective of African Muslims in Brazil is often overlooked, as is that of the religion of Islam. The exploits of the Hausa and Yoruba Muslims in the 1814 and 1835 slave revolts of Bahia remind us that Islam played a crucial role in unifying multi-ethnic African Muslims and was seen as a form of resistance amongst non-Muslim African slaves in their struggle against the racial and religious oppression they had suffered at the hands of the Portuguese. Many within the Movimento Negro, Black movement of Brazil, draw inspiration from the courage of African Muslims who fought for their freedom. All right. In order to understand modern day race relation in Brazil, it is important to gain an understanding of its early history during which indigenous and Black Africans were enslaved by Portuguese. Since time immemorial, slavery has existed, but not to the extent nor with the appalling condition with which Europeans carried out during the transatlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. During this period, an estimate 4 million Africans were transported to Brazil by Europeans. Brazil received approximately 10 times more slaves than the United States of America. In other words, that's why you see a lot of strong African population in Brazil, because they had more slaves over there in their country than America did. It says the slavery of African people in the Americas was a destructive process of oppression and dehumanization. Many people are aware of the enslavement of African peoples in the United States, but little is known about the massive and brutal enslavement of Africans in South American countries such as Brazil. Although slavery in the United States was brutal, it was even more worse in Brazil, where the Portuguese treated African slaves barbarically for over 300 years. In comparison to Brazil, Africans and their descendants were better treated in the United States because the Portuguese were able to obtain new slaves easily and cheaply. Since Brazil was considerably closer to Africa than North America was, the Portuguese would work slaves to death and then pick up more slaves in West and Central Africa. Slave labor was free labor, and it was the foundation on which Brazil's modern-day society is built. Though many Brazilians do not like to admit this historical fact, as historian and expert on Brazilian slavery, Joao José Reis said, slavery is an inconvenient history for the Brazilian elite who try to portray an image of racial harmony. Despite the government's attempts, when it comes to issue of race, it can be argued that Brazil has not been able to move forward because it has yet to fully acknowledge its shameful history. The more than 4 centuries of barbaric treatment by Portuguese colonizer towards African and Amerindian slaves have ramification even today. The large wealth disparity that currently exists between Brazil's white and non-whites is largely due to the country's horrific past. Brazil owes a debt to its black and mixed race population whose ancestors built the country with their free labor. Does that not sound familiar? So, in other words, they fight for reparation in Brazil from the Portuguese. But again, I want you guys to check out this book right here. It seems like a great book. As a matter of fact, I'm gonna order this book myself. It's called The Illuminating Blackness, Blacks and African Muslims in Brazil. Okay, by Habeeb Akande. Habeeb Akande. All right. So I think you guys need to check this book out. And like I said, I'm gonna check it out myself. I'm gonna make sure I put that on my list because I'm very desperate and I'm very interested in reading that book. Yeah, I am very interested in reading that book for real. All right. So that's pretty much it. That's all I have for tonight. And I thank you guys for those of you that came in and watched the channel, support the channel and like the channel, all that great stuff. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you like what you see and you like the stuff that I post on here, you like the contents, please make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, share the channel, and tell your friends about it, etc. Yeah, tell your friends about it. Or tell your families about it. Or you can talk to your colleagues, whatever you want to do. So make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and like the channel. And until next time, y'all take it easy. Peace and power elevation be to all of you. This your girl Tiffany, and I'm locking off saying deuces. And I will reconnect with you all later. All right. Salam alaikum, rahmatullah, and Ramadan Mubarak. And everybody else have a good evening or good night. All right.